It was a brilliant, sunny afternoon in downtown Atlanta. The kind of day where the city felt alive, bustling with people, cars, and the unmistakable hum of urban life. The streets shimmered under the heat, the pavement reflecting the sunlight in every direction. Yet, amidst the lively scene, Susan sat quietly on a bench by the curb, her eyes fixed on her phone screen. As an African-American woman, Susan had grown used to the occasional sideways glance from strangers. But today was different. Today she wasn't just anyone. She was the wife of Captain Anthony Wilson, the newly appointed captain of the Atlanta Police Department. And despite the feeling of pride that filled her chest, she also couldn't shake the tight knot of anxiety that had been building ever since she left her apartment. She hadn't expected her husband to be late, not today of all days. But as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, she found herself looking up from her phone, scanning the street, waiting. She wasn't just waiting for her husband to show up. She was waiting for the recognition of her husband's hard work, of their shared journey, and of the respect he'd earned in his career. But as the minutes ticked away, something felt off. Two police officers, Officers Johnson and Thompson, were walking toward her, and something about their demeanor set her nerves on edge. Their eyes weren't just passing over her, they were lingering. The kind of look that made her skin prickle, her heartbeat quicken. Was she being paranoid? No, something about this situation felt wrong. Susan straightened up, pushing any lingering doubts to the back of her mind. He had to stay calm. "Excuse me, miss." Officer Johnson's voice cut through the air, thick and unfriendly. His eyes scanned her body with deliberate slowness, his gaze cold. "Yes," Susan replied, her voice even, although her stomach tightened in an instant. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his words laced with suspicion. His tone felt like an accusation. Susan forced a polite smile, hoping to diffuse any tension. "I'm just waiting for my husband. He's running a bit late." There was a slight pause. Then Officer Thompson, the younger of the two, raised an eyebrow and shot a look to Officer Johnson. "What's your husband's name?" he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Susan's instincts screamed that something wasn't right, but she pushed those feelings down. "Captain Anthony Wilson. He's the new captain of the Atlanta Police Department." For a moment she thought she saw a flicker of hesitation in their eyes, a glimmer of uncertainty. But it was gone in an instant, replaced with an air of arrogance that made Susan's blood boil. Johnson's lips curled into a sneer as he took a step closer. "Well, miss," he said, voice dripping with disdain, "we're going to have to ask you to stand up and turn around. We need to search you." Susan's eyes widened in disbelief and her heart raced. What? "I'm not doing anything wrong." Officer Thompson took a step forward, his hand brushing the holster of his gun. His voice lowered but remained menacing. "Ma'am, please cooperate. We have reason to believe you may be involved in some suspicious activity." Susan's mind was in overdrive. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, to demand an explanation. But she knew better. She had to stay calm, stay composed. For her and for her husband who had worked so hard to get where he was. She stood slowly, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender, her eyes never leaving the officers. They began to pat her down, their movements slow and deliberate, making Susan feel small and helpless. She felt humiliated, her dignity slipping through her fingers. But it wasn't just the indignity of the situation that angered her. It was the realization that yet again she was being profiled. It was a bitter pill to swallow. As the officers continued to search her, Susan's phone buzzed in her pocket. She grabbed it quickly, pulling it out, eager for a distraction. It was a message from Anthony. "Hey babe, running a bit late. Where are you?" Her heart skipped a beat. Susan typed back quickly. "Anthony, I'm on the corner of 5th and Main. 2 officers are harassing me. Please hurry." She hit send and hoped the message would reach him in time. Susan felt a momentary sense of relief after sending the text to Anthony. Her hands were still raised in the air, but now she felt a glimmer of hope. Her husband, the new captain of the Atlanta Police Department, would be here soon. He would make sure this madness ended. But the officers weren't letting up. Officer Johnson and Officer Thompson kept their eyes trained on her, their expressions unreadable, but something about the way they stood sent chills down her spine. "Everything all right, miss?" Officer Johnson asked, his voice cold and distant, as though he were daring her to say something wrong. Susan forced herself to hold eye contact, a wave of anger swirling inside her chest. She wasn't going to let them see how rattled she felt. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice betraying no emotion. Just then she saw the unmistakable black SUV pull up to the curb. Susan's heart gave a violent thud as the door swung open, and out stepped her husband, Anthony. There he was, tall, strong, and exuding authority in every step. His face was an unbending mask of calm, but Susan, as his partner, knew him well enough to see the tension in his shoulders and the dangerous glint in his eyes. She knew this wasn't going to be pretty. Anthony strode toward the officers, his presence commanding their attention immediately. The officers straightened up, a subtle unease creeping into their stance. "Can I help you, officers?" Anthony's voice was deep and steady, a hint of tension lacing the words. It was the kind of voice that made people take notice, but today it would make the officers uneasy. Officer Johnson stepped forward, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "We're just doing a routine stop, Captain," he said, his eyes flicking nervously to Susan. This woman was acting suspiciously. Anthony's gaze was laser-focused on Officer Johnson as he assessed the situation. He could see the defensive stance of the officers, the calculated attempt to justify their actions. His eyes then shifted to Susan, and his jaw clenched as he took in the humiliation in her posture. The familiar anger began to rise within him. "I see," Anthony said, his voice growing colder. He turned to the officers, his eyes narrowing. "And what exactly was she doing that seemed suspicious?" Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably, clearly not prepared for Anthony's scrutiny. "She was just sitting here not doing anything, but she looked out of place, so we thought we'd check her out." His words were defensive, dismissive, as if Susan were some kind of intruder. That was the moment. Anthony's eyes went ice-cold, his posture rigid with rage, but his voice was a calm, controlled thunder. "I see," he repeated, his voice like a blade. "Let me tell you something, officers. This woman is my wife. And I don't appreciate you harassing her." The words hung in the air, thick with tension. Johnson and Thompson's faces drained of color, their arrogant expressions faltering as they realized the gravity of their mistake. Anthony took another step forward, his stance exuding power. "You didn't know who she was, did you? You saw a black woman sitting on a bench and assumed she was up to no good." His voice dropped dangerously low. "That's not policing, officers. That's racial profiling." The words struck like a slap, and for a moment the officers seemed stunned. Their eyes darted to each other, and Susan could almost see the wheels turning in their heads, realizing they had miscalculated in a big way. The weight of Anthony's words settled heavily on the officers. The realization of what they had just done, the racial profiling, the harassment, the injustice, was starting to hit them. But before they could utter an apology or offer an excuse, Anthony's phone rang, cutting through the moment of stunned silence. His expression hardened further as he checked the screen and answered it. "What is it, Chief?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying the tension of the situation. Susan stood silently, watching her husband. She could tell something was wrong by the grim look that settled over Anthony's face. His eyes met hers, a mix of frustration and determination in his gaze. She felt a knot of dread in her stomach. "What is it, Anthony?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with concern. He turned his attention back to the phone call, his expression darkening with every word he heard. "It's the chief," he said quietly, his tone tightening. "There have been complaints about Johnson and Thompson. They have a history of racial profiling and harassment." Susan's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced with disbelief. How could they have been doing this for so long? "That's outrageous," Susan exclaimed, her voice rising with outrage. "What are you going to do about it?" "I'm not letting this slide," Anthony replied firmly, his hand gripping the phone tightly. "Not on my watch." Without another word, Anthony ended the call and turned back to the officers. They stood in front of him, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. But Anthony wasn't intimidated. His anger was palpable, and he wasn't going to let this go. "Officers Johnson and Thompson," Anthony began, his voice calm yet dripping with authority, "you are hereby suspended pending an investigation into your actions. You will turn in your badges and guns and report to the precinct for further instructions." The officers looked like they had been struck by a thunderclap. They were completely unprepared for this turn of events, and their faces twisted with shame and frustration. But Anthony didn't care about their protests. He stepped closer, his gaze hard as steel. "You should have thought about this before you decided to harass my wife," he said coldly, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "Now turn in your badges and guns. And get out of my sight." Johnson and Thompson stood there for a moment, stunned, before reluctantly complying. Their movements were slow, as if every step was a painful admission of their wrongdoings. With heads down, they handed over their badges and guns, their faces flushed with embarrassment and anger. Susan watched the scene unfold in front of her, her heart swelling with pride for her husband. He had stood up for her, for justice, in a way that was powerful, unwavering, and resolute. She couldn't have been prouder. As the officers walked away, their heads hung low, Susan felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. Anthony turned to her, his face softening with concern. "Are you okay, babe?" he asked, his voice gentle, the anger from moments before gone. Susan nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She had felt helpless, humiliated, but now, all she felt was an overwhelming sense of gratitude and love for her husband. "I'm fine," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to you." Anthony smiled softly, pulling her into an embrace. "Anytime, babe," he whispered. "That's what husbands are for." As they stood there in the middle of the street, holding each other tightly, Susan felt the power of love and justice collide in that moment. She knew that no matter what, they would face the world together. Susan felt the warmth of Anthony's embrace, but it wasn't just the comfort of his arms around her that made her feel safe. It was the certainty in his presence, the promise that no matter what, they would face the world together. However, as the officers trudged away in defeat, Susan couldn't shake off the weight of what had just happened. The racial profiling, the unwarranted harassment, it wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a cruel reminder of how many others were treated unfairly simply because of their skin color. The humiliation she'd felt was only one small part of a much larger issue, and it left her unsettled. But in that moment, she knew there was hope. Anthony's actions had sent a clear message. Justice would not be ignored, not by him, not by anyone. As the sun continued to shine down on the bustling city of Atlanta, it felt as though the energy around them had shifted. People on the streets who had witnessed the confrontation were starting to take notice. Susan could hear murmurs of admiration and respect for Anthony, though some were still processing the gravity of the situation. "Come on," Anthony said, pulling her gently toward the SUV. "Let's get out of here." Susan nodded, feeling both grateful and weary. As they drove away from the scene, she couldn't help but glance back at the place where it all unfolded, the weight of the incident still pressing down on her. But she knew that her husband had just set a powerful precedent, and that felt like a small victory in a much larger fight. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere had changed. News of the incident spread quickly through the force, reaching the chief's office, where a meeting had already been called. Anthony sat in the conference room, a sense of calm determination on his face. He knew this was just the beginning. Racial profiling and systemic inequality couldn't be dismantled overnight, but he also knew that his position gave him the power to make real, tangible changes. And today was proof that his voice and his actions could make a difference. As the door to the conference room opened, the chief walked in, his face serious but with an understanding nod toward Anthony. "We need to have a talk," the chief began, his voice level. "About today. About what happened." Anthony met his gaze head-on. "I know what happened, and I don't want it to happen again." The chief sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I've been getting complaints about those two for a while now. I should have acted sooner." "That's the problem," Anthony said, his voice firm. "It's easy to ignore the signs when they don't directly affect you. But when it's your officers making the mistake, you have no choice but to deal with it." "I know," the chief responded quietly. "But the culture needs to change. This can't be brushed under the rug. We're going to need a full investigation into Johnson and Thompson." Anthony nodded, relieved that the chief understood the gravity of the situation. "Good. I want to be part of that investigation. I'll do everything I can to make sure this doesn't happen again." As days passed, the events of that afternoon became the subject of conversation not just in the precinct, but throughout the city. News outlets caught wind of the incident, and soon Anthony's handling of the situation was being praised for its fairness and commitment to justice. But for Anthony and Susan, the experience brought them even closer together. The events had shaken them both, but they had stood strong through it. Together they were a team, one that would never shy away from doing what was right no matter the cost. Susan had taken some time to reflect on everything. She knew the racial inequality that existed, but witnessing it firsthand had been a brutal reminder. She decided to use her voice too. She began reaching out to local organizations wanting to get involved in community outreach programs, offering support and guidance for those who had experienced similar situations. Meanwhile, Anthony spent his days meeting with other officers, conducting training on racial profiling, and working with the chief to ensure the culture within the department would start shifting. His message was clear: accountability would be the new norm. Weeks later, things began to change in small but significant ways. The Atlanta Police Department started implementing new policies, ones that emphasized community trust, accountability, and transparency. Officers were now required to undergo regular sensitivity training, focusing on issues of race, bias, and how to properly engage with citizens from all walks of life. While not everyone embraced the new changes, there was no denying that a shift was happening. Anthony had started a ripple effect in his department, and though it would take time, he was confident it was the right direction. For Susan, it was a bittersweet victory. She had seen firsthand the pain that racial profiling caused, but she also witnessed how one person's actions could challenge an entire system. One evening, as she and Anthony sat on their porch watching the sunset, she turned to him with a quiet smile. "You know," Susan said softly, "I never thought I'd be here, telling you how proud I am of you. But I am. I'm proud of everything you're doing. You're changing things for the better." Anthony smiled back at her, his eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, babe. You kept me grounded. You kept me focused. We're in this together." Months passed, and the change that Anthony had fought for began to take root. The department became more inclusive, more responsive, and more committed to building a better relationship with the community. As for Susan, she found a renewed sense of purpose. She became a vocal advocate for racial justice, speaking at town hall meetings, organizing workshops, and pushing for stronger policies within the department. But despite all the progress, Susan and Anthony knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for equality would always be ongoing, and they were ready to face whatever came next, side by side. As they walked through downtown Atlanta one evening, hand in hand, Susan glanced up at Anthony with a smile. "You know, babe," she said, "today's a good day. We've come a long way." "We have," Anthony replied, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "But there's more to do. And we're just getting started." With that, they walked off into the horizon, ready for the challenges ahead, knowing that together they could change the world.